Welcome everybody. Peter sends his apologies. He can't be with us this afternoon, so I'm chairing the session, replacing him today. I'd like to welcome Dr. Gideon Windecker and introduce him. He is the regional representative to the Gulf state at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, a German foundation that engages in political, economic, and social development worldwide. He studied political science, Islamic studies, and English literature at Tübingen University in Germany, and holds a PhD in Islamic and Middle Eastern studies. The focus of his academic research is Middle Eastern politics, religious minorities, and the socio-economic dynamics of political conflicts. Before taking up his position in the Gulf, Dr. Windecker worked in international development, human rights, and the rule of law throughout the Middle East, with a focus on Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon. The scope of his current work includes international relations, socio-economic transformation, political radicalization, and media development in Gulf states. His recent publications include The Gulf States' Complex Relationship with Iran, Media and Modernization in Oman, in German, and The Nuclear Agreement with Iran. And finally, Qatar between marketing and realpolitik. So as you could see, Dr. Windecker combines his academic training in Islamic studies and political science with also working for a German think tank, so he's hands-on, as it were. Please welcome Dr. Windecker, and his title today is Between Modernization and Radicalisation, Saudi Youth and the Islamist Challenge. Eden.
Thank you very much, Professor Madawi, for this kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you very much to the Middle East Institute for this kind invitation through Veronica Defner. Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to be here. It's actually my first time in Singapore, and I'm great to share some of my insights with you on Saudi Arabia. As Professor Madawi already said, my academic background is more the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Lebanese component of the conflict, but my practical work with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation deals a lot with the Gulf states, and one of them, of course, Saudi Arabia. We work a lot with youth to empower youth to claim their own future. So this is also the background to this presentation. Now, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is one of the major political foundations in Germany. We have around 80 offices worldwide, and I'm heading the Gulf office, as Professor Madawi mentioned. So let me start with my presentation. Okay. Okay, there we go. It's a little slow. Let's see, it works well. So, looking at Saudi youth. Saudi youth is in a big conflict in between modernization on the one side, looking at the international world, and radicalization on the other side, looking at organizations such as the Islamic State. Now, I want to start my talk with a question. What makes these 17-year-old kids pick up an AK-47 instead of trying to start a business? Now, this is a question the State Department spokesman Marie Harf asked in February 2015. And of course, it's a question that has confounded the world latest since 9/11 and the rise of global jihadism. If we check the internet, we come across a lot of easy answers: economic misery, poverty, poor governance. But of course, the truth is much more complexing, and we want to look into some of the elements that hopefully shape a kind of answer. And of course, with the rise of the Islamic State, a whole new set of questions has emerged. For example, what makes a self-declared religious leader burn a Jordanian pilot alive and make it go viral on the web? Okay. Or this one, what makes 6 young men lure their cousin into the desert and kill him based on religious beliefs, such as happened recently in Saudi Arabia? Now, when we look at the phenomenon of the Islamic State, we see a large attraction among young people around the world, in spite of the horror that is happening. If we look at these figures, two countries are outstanding, especially which are Tunisia and Saudi Arabia. Now, Tunisia, of course, is a different story as an Arab Spring country, a young democracy with a lot of economic and social problems. But when we look at Saudi Arabia, we have an entirely different picture. And according to these figures, it's around 2,500. Now, I have chosen on purpose these very conservative figures. I think the unofficial numbers are much higher. And there's actually newly leaked material that claims that 25% of all Daesh fighters are, or fighters in general, it's not only Daesh, of course, it's also Jabhat al-Nusra and other organizations. But according to these figures that have not been proven, not been confirmed so far, the Saudi participation would be around 6,000 or over 6,000, which is twice as many as according to the other conservative figures. So when we look at Saudi Arabia, we see one of the richest countries in the world, one of world's largest oil exporters. Over the last few years, especially during the Arab Spring, it has been the beacon of stability in the Middle East plagued by wars and revolutions. But it also has been a cradle of ideology of intolerance that has been exported worldwide and has laid the groundwork for radical movements such as the Islamic State. So today I want to take you on a short journey into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to look a little bit behind the facades and to get some understanding of how young people in Saudi Arabia live and think and how they see their future. And of course the question, what is it that makes young people in such a rich country as Saudi Arabia give up their lives, their comfort, their families in order to fight and die in a foreign country? Now I want to say this right at the beginning. Okay. Thank you. Young Saudis supporting the Islamic State are a relatively small percentage of the population. According to a recent study by the Washington Institute, they're around 5%. But of course, radicalism does not only include supporting Daesh. There's a lot of other radical, jihadi, non-jihadi organizations. Some people now count today 50 radical jihadi groups. And of course, we also have to see that these kinds of statistics always have to be taken with a grain of salt. Because of course, obviously in a survey, not everybody would admit supporting the Islamic State. And also the question, what does support really mean, is very difficult to answer. Does it mean that they support their policies? Does it mean a certain degree of approval? Does it mean financing? Does it mean campaigning to recruit fighters? It's a lot of varieties. But if we stick to this figure of 5%, we come across around 500,000 young Saudi nationals, which is around the population of southeastern Singapore. So it's a rather large number, even if it's only the 5%. So today I want to ask three very simple questions, and I hope we can look into them to find an answer to the question of radicalization. First of all, I want to look at what does it mean to grow up in Saudi Arabia. I want to give a few points explaining the contradictions, the religious background, and the education system. And then we want to look into how do young people cope with these developments and all these contradictions. And in the end, I want to give a short outlook in what is going on currently, economically, socially, and what is expecting Saudi Arabia in the upcoming years. So let's look briefly at some contradictions of what does it mean to grow up in Saudi Arabia. Actually, growing up in Saudi Arabia these days means a lot of things. It's especially confusing time for many. So let's look at some of the cleavages. The first one I want to mention is diversity versus conformity. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia is a very, very diverse country. We have at least 3 or 4 different regions. We have the religious centers in the west. We have Jeddah as an economic center with a lot of pilgrims getting there, a lot of international life there. Then we have the religious center of the Saud family and the Sheikh family forming the core of what is today Saudi Arabia in the middle, in Riyadh. And we have, of course, in the eastern province, we have a Shiite minority, some say up to 50% Shia population. So it's a very, very diverse country. Of course, there are oil resources in the east as well. But at the same time, we have a very conservative system creating an artificial conformity, which not only shows in the dress code, but also in social values and norms. The second contradiction I want to mention is modernism versus conservatism. Of course, on the one hand, we have a pro-Western king who is considered secular by many, and on the other hand, we have a orthodox, anti-Western Islamist establishment. And interestingly enough, we could say that Saudi Arabia is maybe one of the only countries in the world where the large parts of the population are more conservative than the government. Another contradiction is affluence versus poverty. On the one hand, we have around 6,000 plus princes who own half the country, who are Western educated, have a liberal lifestyle. One of them is, of course, Walid ibn Talal, who has a net worth of $22.8 billion, according to Forbes. On the other hand, we have growing figures of poverty. Official numbers, according to the World Bank, are only 12.7% of poverty rate, but local journalists and activists paint a rather different pictures. They speak of up to 30% poverty. And a few years ago, two young journalists were arrested for producing a small documentary on poverty in Saudi Arabia and putting it on YouTube. Then, of course, we have a very rich economy, which is poorly diversified. If we look at the GDP, it's around $746 billion, which is more than twice the GDP of Singapore. But if we look at the oil and gas contribution, we have in budget revenues over 80%, GDP 45%, and export 90%. So we have an economy strongly dependent on the oil and gas factor. And if we look at the chart on the left side, the GDP breakdown, we see the one coming right after oil and gas is actually government services, which says a lot. I think the battery is not really, okay. The next contradiction is the national labor force versus foreign labor. We have around 30 million people in Saudi Arabia. 9 million of them are foreigners, which is around 30%. And if we look at the labor market, we see that 90% of the private sector is foreign labor. And if we look at the Saudi distribution in the different sectors, we have only 1.6 million Saudis working in the private sector. The public sector is 3.2 million Saudis. Of course, gender is always an issue. Saudi Arabia is a country of gender segregation, exclusion of women from public life. But the factor I want to look at here is women participation in education and labor market. If we look at the universities, we have a small majority of women among Saudi students, and even more so when we look at the percentage of bachelor degrees, most of them are women. But then if you look at the labor market, it's only 13% of women. Now this figure is rising, but of course it's a very low figure also compared to other GCC countries. And last not least is of course the social contract that is marking the entire system. It's based on an alimentation and job security versus lack of in exchange to no political participation, basically according to the Hobbesian principle, give me security and I will not ask for liberty. So these are some of the basic contradictions. Now, in order to understand radicalization in Saudi Arabia, it's very important to have a more detailed idea of how the religious system is structured. Of course, Salafism is a very broad term and used in the West many times just to describe extremism. But Salafism is a very complex phenomenon, and it's very important to look at the different factors. In spite of the apparent uniformity, the religious scene in Saudi Arabia is very broad and ranges from orthodox traditionalist to radical jihadi. Now, the concept of Salafism as we know it today is basically started with the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah, who was a Muslim scholar in the 13th century, at a time of political crisis. And as most ideologies and new ideas, also his ideology was based on a time of crisis. The Mongols were at the doorsteps. And he believed that this was due to the rulers and the Muslims having left the right path. So he had basically 4 goals, and these 4 goals are very basic to understand modern Salafism. The first one is he requested a just Muslim ruler, just like Muhammad and the first caliphs had been. And he requested a return to the values of the early Ummah, the Muslim community. And also a return to the lifestyle of the Prophet's companion, the Salaf, which is the Arabic word for the companions of the Prophet. And the 4th point is waging jihad to re-establish the Islamic Empire. Now, of course, these 4 principles are very broad, and they can be understood in many different ways. And this counts especially for the notion of jihad, which we're going to look into after a few minutes. Now, there are basically 3 different kind of schools in Saudi Arabia. The first one, I want to call it Orthodox Wahhabism, although Wahhabism is a term that is no longer used today, but it was used up to the 70s because the Wahhabis tried to distinguish themselves from the activist Salafis, and this is why I'm using this term. Nowadays, they refuse to call themselves Salafis because Wahhabis, because they say they don't want to be called after their founder, but based on the companions of the Prophet. So the first group, and the second group is activist Salafists. I inserted the flag of the Muslim Brothers here, which is of course not totally correct, but it's more the symbolic value of the ideology coming from the Muslim Brotherhood. So, and the third one is radical jihadi Salafism. So we will look at these 3 schools really briefly, and then I will expand on the third school and the consequences for youth. Traditionalist Wahhabism. Now, the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah were, of course, adopted by many different scholars. One of them was Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the Arabian Peninsula in the 18th century, and used by Muhammad ibn Saud to unite the tribes and conquer the Arabian Peninsula. So it was basically a more or less secular ruler got his political legitimacy through an alliance with an elite of religious scholars. In exchange, these scholars were allowed to impose their view of Islam on the entire country. And this is basically that marks the birth of Saudi Arabia. It's the very essence of the state, this kind of unequal marriage, and it makes Saudi Arabia as a nation state quite unique. And of course, it implies a kind of power sharing, which is of course known to all of you. It can be summarized as the House of Saud being in charge of foreign policy and economic policies, and all other larger political domains in this field, especially of course the exploitation of the oil resources. And the Wahhabis of the Al-Sheikh family, on the other hand, control domestic and social policies. Now, this status started shifting in the 1970s. And here we come to the second school, the activist Salafi school. Now, Orthodox Wahhabism, as I said, is basically state supporting. It means one side legitimizes the other, and the other side, the one side supports the other side. So there is not much potential for political upheaval here, only for a lot of social conservatism. Looking at activist Salafism. So as I just said, this status started to change in the 1970s when a lot of scholars from Iraq, Syria, and Egypt poured into the country, forming the Sahwa movement, Sahwa al-Islamiyya, the Islamic awakening. Now these schools mainly came from the Muslim Brotherhood, and they were led into Saudi Arabia to form an alliance against Nasserism and Pan-Arabism. The Sahwa movement can be best explained as a conglomerate of Wahhabi thinking with Ikhwani or Muslim Brotherhood thinking. One of the scholars was the brother of Said Qutb, one of course one of the renowned scholars of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt. Now in the 1980s, these scholars were given a lot of control over the education system, and they established an entire set of Islamist curricula and school books in the public schools. And until the 1990s, they became one of the predominant factors in Saudi Arabia. Now, their main teachings are actually quite radical. Tawhid versus Jahiliyyah, which means there's a black and white thinking, there's a divide between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world. You're not allowed to be friends with non-Muslims, but also you're not allowed to be friends with Shia or then later non-Salafi Sunnis. They promoted a very strict social conservatism and gender segregation, but unlike the Wahhabis, they promoted political activism and called for reforms, but they taught in the 90s the legitimacy of the Saudi regime. They also called for classical jihadism, and I'm going to explain the concept of the different forms of jihadism in a bit. They were, one of the most important factors is they were organized in so-called jama'at, or organizations, societies, and this is where they managed to gather a lot of youth around them. They had summer schools, they had student meetings, they had an entirely well-equipped network. So the entire generation of Saudis growing up in the 80s and 90s, basically, if they were not studying abroad or for other reasons, they basically grew up in these circles of religious people who promoted a certain degree of activism. Some of them became very popular among young students, and I'm going to look at this in a bit. Let me just mention two names, Safar al-Hawali and Salman al-Awda. And this is, of course, the expertise of Professor Madawi. Now, in the 1990s, things started changing. So far, the activist Salafists had supported the Saudi regime. They were actually called by the Saudi regime to form a conservative education curriculum, among others. But in 1990, King Fahd invited US troops to be stationed in Saudi Arabia in his war against Saddam Hussein, and most religious scholars were extremely upset to have non-Muslim soldiers stationed in the Holy Land of Saudi Arabia. So they became very active, criticizing this policy, and called for the king to adopt reforms towards a more Islamist society. In 1992, 110 scholars signed a so-called Memorandum of Consultation, which calls for reforms and more participation rights of the religious scholars. Now the King Fahd, considered this an affront to his power and to the stability of the kingdom. So he fought back, withdrew his support from these scholars, and arrested hundreds of influential scholars in 1994-95. Although many of them were freed a few years later, and they were co-opted by the state. And until today, they have developed a very wide range of views, from modernist, such as Salman al-Awda, towards more radical, such as Muhammad al-Arifi, and we will get back to these names in a bit. Now, while these Sahwa scholars were in prison in the 1990s, there was a new school arising that propagated global jihad, which was a different form of jihad. I'm going to explain in a bit. And these doctrines became the basis of Al-Qaeda, and then, of course, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. One of the main propagators was Sheikh Mahmoud Ash'aibi, who called for a global fight against Christians and Jews, and who praised the Taliban for establishing, so they say, the only state where there is no human law. He completely rejected the Saudi government as un-Islamic and called for the re-establishment of a real Islamic state. Now, the Saudi authorities obviously reacted very harshly and arrested numerous Al-Qaeda scholars. Most of them remain in jail, and among others, others fled to Yemen. This was mainly due after the 2003 attacks on residential buildings in Riyadh that was targeting mainly foreigners. Now let's look at the principles of jihadism, because this is one of the core elements why young people join the jihad of the Islamic State. We already mentioned the Orthodox Wahhabis, and their jihadism was a very conservative one. So let's call it Orthodox jihadism. It was seen as a defensive fight against a non-Muslim aggressor under the command of a leader. But here's, of course, where the paradox starts, because Saudi Arabia started in a conquest war in the Arabian Peninsula, and then once the kingdom was established, jihad was banned. And this is why Orthodox scholars today usually do not support any form of jihad unless it's legitimized by the Saudi ruler. Then we have the concept of traditional jihadism, which is partially practiced by the activist schools. It's also a defensive war against the non-Muslim aggressor, but it's not seen as something that has to be legitimized by the king, but it's an individual duty, fard ayn in Arabic. So it's legitimized by the religious scholars, the religious elite, not the ruler. So this means that young people, if the religious scholars called on them, could go and fight in Afghanistan or in Chechnya. And this is a position that was adopted by many of the Sahwa leaders. Interestingly, it was also partially propagated by the Orthodox scholars until the government realized that it backfired on them, because suddenly they had all these fighters coming back from Afghanistan and other countries, and it's a problem they have today in Iraq as well. And the third group is of course global jihad, which is a different kind of jihad. It's not the classical jihad of fighting against an oppressor. It's an individual jihad fighting against Western and mainly American targets worldwide. And of course, this is the jihad of Osama bin Laden. Interestingly, Osama bin Laden recruited a lot of young people based on the concept of classical jihadism. He told the young people they would go and fight in Palestine and Afghanistan. And once they were in his training schools, he would indoctrinate them towards fighting the West. And he said, we first have to fight American aggression before we fight with our brothers in Afghanistan. So these are the main components, really briefly, about the different schools, the different Salafi schools in Saudi Arabia. And we're going to look at how they influenced youth. But before that, I want to have a short look at the education system, like some basic core elements and how it developed. Because after all, if you want to know your country's future, you have to look at the education system. Now, until recently, the Saudi education system had one clear target. It was promoting the Saudi branch of Salafism as taught by the Sahwa and producing devout, submissive Muslims who would not question religious and political authority. So it was a very pacifist approach in this sense, never question religious authority, meaning never question the Saudi rule. All education in all fields was based on the Quran, even science class. Philosophy, drama, and music was banned as un-Islamic, and female education was non-existing until the late 1960s. Now, the main principle of education was memorization, based on the principle, of course, of the early Quran schools. Creativity was not in demand, and neither was practical or rational thinking in the way we know it. Now, of course, such an education system has tremendous consequences for the labor market. Hardly any skills were taught that prepared the young generation for a real job in the private sector. So what the government did is it created more and more government jobs, financed, of course, with the oil revenues. The private sector, as I mentioned earlier, was filled with foreign workers. Today, around 29% of young Saudis are unemployed. This is the highest figure worldwide after Iraq and Palestine. Women unemployment is 33%, but the actual number of women not working is 60%. So they count here 33% are job seekers, female job seekers that do not find a job. Total women not working is 60%, so it's an important difference. And we have around plus minus 30% dropout from the universities. So this is just to look at the economic side of it. But coming back to ideology, one of the biggest problems is that Saudi schools educated their kids in a fashion that encouraged intolerance towards others, Christian, Jews, non-Wahhabi Muslims, and especially the Shia. And the consequences we see it these days in attacks against Shia mosques. Now, these are school books that were in the curricula until 2010. They were then taken out, and they found a different usage. Actually, the Islamic State took a lot of Saudi school books, probably ripped out the page with the Saudi flag, and used it for their own children. They also banned numerous books from liberals, also of course Saudi liberals and other Gulfi liberals, which promoted human rights and democracy. So what they taught was an anti-intellectual version of Islam, which was closed towards any kind of reform, because reform was seen as a westernization and liberalization. So even the efforts of back then the Minister of Education, who tried to promote reforms, Mohammed al-Rashid, they were pretty much in vain, because the religious scholars were so powerful that they could not, that even the Minister of Education did not have a hand in it. So it was only after 9/11 and after the 2003 attacks in Riyadh that Saudi Arabia realized that they really, really need education reforms. And this happened especially with King Abdullah rising to power then in 2005. King Abdullah was actually, in this regard, was really a visionary who tried to implement a lot of reforms. What they did in 2005, they removed 2,000 teachers from their posts due to radical views, and 400 teachers were arrested for ties to Al-Qaeda. Only in 2011, the kingdom spent around $40 billion on education. Of course, this was in reaction to the fears of an Arab Spring. Other projects by King Abdullah, and I think they're really important because this is really the way forward. There was the Princess Noura University for Women. It was established as a college in the 1970s, but it was opened as the largest female university in the world. The King Abdullah University for Science and Technology, which was the first mixed campus with science and research. So really controversial to the way young Saudis had been educated. And of course, a mixed education was not accepted by the religious scholars. Another important point is the scholarship programs for around 150,000 students traveling abroad internationally, getting ideas of the world, how it is outside Saudi Arabia. Now, the concept of King Abdullah was really to create a knowledge-based economy and distract young people from joining radicalism. But we have to see this change came about only around 5 years ago. That means an entire generation of young people is out there today that was still brought up under the old system. So this just a few basic points of their education system. To summarize up, what does it mean to grow up in Saudi Arabia? It means a life in contradictions under an ultra-conservative system, living in artificial conformity. It means an economic system which does not require young people to make efforts to make a living, and an ideology that teaches intolerance and the fight against non-Muslims and non-Salafi Muslims. A contradicting doctrine of jihad, where young people are not sure when they should go and fight and when not, and a studying with school books that were taken over one by the Islamic State. So how did young people react to these issues? How do they deal with these contradictions? Let's just look at some numbers here. We see that around 50% of the population are under 20 years old. So this is an incredible potential and challenge for the future. And altogether, around 70% are under 30 years old. Let's look at the social pattern, the social fabric in Saudi Arabia. Research actually shows that most young Saudis, the large majority, do not care much about politics. Looking at the education system, this might not come much as a surprise. As long as the social contract works and they are satisfied materially, they will accept their status as subjects rather than citizens. They consider the king a father and have a vague idea of change in some distant future. This is basically a summary of some research on the large majority of young Saudis and their views. So based on the system of alimentation, they're not claiming political rights. Now this showed especially during the time of the Arab Spring. Of course there were some revolts, especially women doing demonstrations for more participation. Of course we had large Shia demonstrations in the east, but I want to focus now really on the majority Sunnah population. And here it shows that hardly any one of them participated in the so-called Arab Spring. Actually, when a day of rage was announced for March 11 in 2011, the security forces made a thorough job in intimidating any liberal forces or potential activism. So what happened was only one guy showed up at the demonstration. He was a 40-year-old Saudi and who claimed, and this is what he said into the cameras, there is no freedom of speech in Saudi Arabia and any dissent would be responded to with arrest. And a few minutes after these pictures were taken, he was actually arrested. And according to my knowledge, he's still in jail. So it shows that there's hardly any political interest, and the interest that is there is suppressed by the regime. Now, of course, one of the indicators that mirrors social activism is social media, which of course in Saudi Arabia has had a tremendous impact. So I just want to look at some figures here. We have 41% of Saudis using Twitter. We have 75% of the population using smartphones. And just Saudi accounts for 40% of Twitter usage all over the Arab world. So these are tremendous figures. Now, social media also shows that there's only a small minority that believes in diversity, open-mindedness, and tolerance. And even a smaller minority is risking to speak openly, such as, I want to bring up here the example of Hamza Kashgari, who wrote a poem about Muhammad, which said, "I shall not kiss your hand, rather I shall shake it as equals do, and smile at you as you smile at me. I shall speak to you as your friend, no more." So this is a poem addressing the Prophet Muhammad, which of course created a lot of upheaval. But what happened, within one day, this one tweet was commented by 30,000 tweets in Saudi Arabia, most of them calling for his punishment, some calling for his execution. They argued he was an apostate since he ridiculed the Prophet Muhammad and he should be executed. Now he apologized, deleted the tweet, he realized what he had done. He fled to Malaysia, but he was captured by the authorities and brought back to Saudi Arabia and condemned by a criminal tribunal. I mean, there's the examples, of course, are manifold. All of you know about Raif Badawi, who claimed that other religions are equal to Islam, and he had a similar fate. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is a really interesting fact. Saudi Arabia may be the only country where the large parts of the population are more conservative than the government. Now, at the same time, Twitter statistics show what is considered mainstream. We have here the number, like top 10 of people being followed on Twitter in Saudi Arabia. Of course, we should be aware that Twitter followers can always be bought, and that also that not every follower is a friend. But what I'm trying to say with this slide is really the tremendous impact these people have. Number one is with around, according to this statistics, 14.5 million followers is Muhammad Al-Arifi. He's a Sahwa scholar who is rather radical today and known for his anti-Shia statements. He's one of the scholars who called for joining jihad in Syria. Another example, he was forbidding Saudi families to watch NBC because he said it's un-Islamic, it promotes un-Islamic practices. He was banned from entering both Switzerland and the UK. So this is the number one. Number two is Ahmed Al-Shughairi. He's a more liberal figure. He studied in the US and ran a famous TV show until it was closed down by the government in 2015 because he criticized the government. So he likes to market a more moderate form of Islam, and he attracts a lot of young people who are not religiously interested. So it's, for young people, it's a doorway into religious life. Number three is Ayat al-Qarni. He's a poet and famous author who is called many times for jihad against Americans. He had a big influence on Al-Qaeda ideology, and he was put on a US non-flight list in 2012, and I hear he was shot at the Philippines last week, and he's now in a hospital in Saudi Arabia. Just a short quote to show the amount of radicalism. He says, "Allah will destroy the Jews and the helpers from among the Christians and the communists, and he will turn them into the Muslim spoils. I praise the jihad and sacrifice and the resistance against the occupiers in Iraq. We curse them, all of them, every night, and pray that Allah will annihilate them, tear them apart, and grant us victory over them." So I would say this is a pretty scary statistic, because this person has around 12 million followers on Twitter. And number four, just briefly, Salman al-Auda. He was a very prominent figure among the Sahwa scholars. He was more radical in the 90s, and then after his release from prison, more moderate and in line with the government. He now calls for constitutional reforms and on an Islamic basis. And just out of interest, if you look down there, we have King Salman, I can't see it from here. Number 8, and then Walid ibn Talal, the rich prince, number 9. So there's a large interest among young people towards mainstream scholars from the Sahwa movement, but also especially scholars who are very open for radical ideas, who tend towards jihadi Islamism. Now, let's look at the radical movement. The liberal movement, of course, is important too, but today we're dealing more with the radical side. The interesting fact is that most young people had a very strong connections to the Sahwa movement. As I mentioned, they grew up under the wing of the Sahwa movement in 80s and 90s. And this is why many of them did not join Al-Qaeda in 2002, 2003, because most Sahwa scholars were against this kind of radicalization. Then support for Al-Qaeda dropped even further after the attacks in 2003, the Riyadh bombing I mentioned. Now, many young people were just scared of so much violence. It was basically the first time since 1979 that there was a major upheaval and disrupting the peace in the kingdom. So unless they were already radicalized and joined Al-Qaeda in Yemen, young people did not really want to be identified with this sort of violence. At the same time, there was also a strong estrangement from established scholars, and there was a lot of confusion going on about jihad, which opened new doors towards radicalization. Because young men, on the one hand, found themselves indoctrinated with jihadism. They were supposed to go and fight in Afghanistan, but then at the same time, fighters who came back were arrested by the Saudi government and were considered terrorists. Now, things, of course, took another turn when it comes to the rise of the Islamic State. Now, suddenly, young Saudis were enthusiastic about its jihadi ideology and did not hide it in their social media activity. We see this statistic here, which shows most tweets in favor of Daesh or the Islamic State come from Saudi Arabia, and only then Syria and Iraq, where the fighters actually are. And this was in spite of drastic measures. I mean, you can go to jail for such a tweet in Saudi Arabia. So, to better understand this fascination with the Islamic State, let's look at some of the main features that distinguish it from Al-Qaeda. Islamic State, as you all know, has an actual territory. They're establishing a caliphate, something Al-Qaeda has only been dreaming about. Osama bin Laden also spoke about a caliphate, but it was something to be established in the distant future. So this means they also have an address where you can travel to. It's not like Al-Qaeda, a clandestine organization. It's actually an alternative to the concept of modern nation states in the Middle East under Sykes-Picot. The Islamic State also has a lot of government structures and funds. It's very well organized, has a lot of resources, and it uses the media, and it's especially social media as an effective PR tool to attract attention through its brutality. So why do young people join the Islamic State? Now I know in the West there's a lot of comparison going on between Saudi Arabia and the Islamic State, but I think it's much more important to look at the differences. Although, of course, there's some good points with the punishments and the legal system, but I think it's much more useful to look at the differences in order to understand why young Saudis join the Islamic State. One of the points is the question of legitimacy of the ruler. In the eyes of radicals, of course, it's a secular, pro-Western power. It's not based on Islamic principles, whereas the Islamic State is ruled by through direct religious legitimization and through the caliphate that was reestablished. In Saudi Arabia, there's a power sharing between a secular power and a religious power, whereas in the Islamic State, there's only a religious power, and they see it as a just power. There's justice, there's equality, there's no corruption, so it is perceived. The scholars mainly are non-political or co-opted in Saudi Arabia, and if they are not, they go to jail, whereas in the Islamic State, they can promote activism and they can recover the Islamic glory, not only talk about it, but actually do it. And of course, this is then true for the jihad. On the one hand, in Saudi Arabia, we have the Salafi teachings, also the more radical Salafi teachings, but jihad is banned in Saudi Arabia. Whereas in the Islamic State, they can freely practice jihad also as individuals. And this is what led young Saudis lure their cousin into the desert and kill him, based on the fact that he was a Saudi soldier, and they say he was part of a non-Muslim regime, and they killed their own cousin. Okay. Now, another interesting point is the timing of when Saudis joined the fight in Iraq, in Syria. It's actually an interesting dynamic, because up to 2013, most foreign fighters were from the Maghreb countries, but things started to change in May 2013, and that was the time when the Lebanese Hezbollah joined the fight in Syria, supporting the Assad regime in the Battle of Qusayr, which became one of the decisive battles which changed the tides in the civil war. And the answer by mainstream clerics was swift. We have here an example of Yusuf al-Qaradawi. He was joined by others, even by the Grand Mufti Abdulaziz al-Sheikh, who suddenly promoted again jihadism, because now it was a as they perceived it, a Sunni Shia war, and they had to fight with their brothers against the Shia powers. So before Qusayr, religious scholars supported, of course, helping the Syrian rebels through financial means, but they were not allowing young Saudis to go and fight. Now here they made this major shift. So it was a shift towards an activist jihad, which the Saudi regime had banned for a long time, especially after the crackdown of Al-Qaeda fighters. But obviously things started backfiring pretty soon when the Saudi fighters returned. The Saudis once more realized they had a problem, and they came up with a new anti-terrorism law in 2014, banning all terrorist activities and other liberal activities as well, and punishing fighters. So it's a double turn of 180 degrees. Do not fight jihad, go and fight jihad. If you fight jihad and come back, you will be punished. So, okay, let's look at as a summary. Why do young Saudis join the Islamic State? As we've seen, the Salafi socialization is very prominent in Saudi Arabia. They grew up in an environment where the school book taught them to fight Christians, Jews, and the Shia. At the same time, as I just mentioned, the government cracked down on fighters. And we have a whole generation growing up between these two lines. Go and fight jihad, stay at home and practice more conservative Islam, or supporting the reform movement. So basically, as I said, they grew up with fighters being praised in Afghanistan and heroes coming back, being arrested. So in Saudi Arabia, what is being preached or has been preached for a long time can no longer be practiced, whereas in the Islamic State, it can. And hand in hand, of course, is the losing of trust in Saudi religious authorities, which opens the door for more alternative scholars, as we've seen in the Twitter statistics. Some of them moderate, of course, but also some of them very radical. Also, many scholars, many children, young people doubted the official ideology after 9/11 because they did not want to be identified with the horrors of 9/11, and they said this cannot be Islam, and if this is based on the teachings of our scholars, something must be terribly wrong. And of course, and I also mentioned that briefly, they can be part of the greater cause. They can reestablish the glorious days of the Caliphate, ending the Sykes-Picot Agreement, ending Western imperialism and predominance. They can live in a country that is pure, that is Muslim, that is only based on the Sharia, and they can practice true Salafi ideals. And also, studies show that many young people join the jihad because of they believe they can practice their manlyhood and fantasies of domination and violence. So, and the last reason, and this should not be underestimated, is the factor of boredom. Growing up in Saudi Arabia means having no jobs, no activities, no cinemas, bars, shopping malls are mainly for families. So young people have all kinds of stupid ideas, and this is probably still one of the better ones. Recently, a Saudi poet published a poem on YouTube saying, "I wish our young people would smoke weed and drink alcohol, because that means they would not go to the Islamic State." So what is really important here is that there's a really strong connection between the economic and social situation and the security situation. A poor social situation means stronger support for radicals. But also, and this just briefly as a side remark, these factors explain why not many Saudi women have joined the Islamic State. It has actually been only 46, because since 2011, only 46 Saudi women have joined jihad in Syria. There are many more women, of course, from Western countries and other countries. But one of the reasons is that this really, the promotion is a promotion of manlyhood. Of course, the Islamic State realized that and published a manifesto, Women in the Islamic State, in September 2015, trying to attract especially Saudi women. They said women in Saudi Arabia have suffered barbaric regime and savage regime. They have been forced into poverty, abused by the criminal justice system, and they should migrate to the ISIS strongholds. That's basically the message of this manifesto. And another reason, of course, is why not many Saudi women join jihad is because it's one of the minor reasons, but I think it shouldn't be underestimated, because Saudi women cannot travel abroad alone, and most fighters join ISIS through Turkey, so they need the permission of a father or a brother or a husband who will not let them go and fight with ISIS. Okay, so this about the radicalization. If we come back to our question, what makes these 17-year-old kids pick up an AK-47 instead of trying to start a business? I want to summarize these factors really quickly. We have suppression of social diversity and individual rights in Saudi Arabia. We have an ideology-driven education, which leads to a lot of intolerance. We have a system of alimentation, which keeps young people passive. We have alienation from religious conservatism due to the factors mentioned. And of course, we have radical groups offering attractive alternatives. These are, I think, the main features. Now, to summarize, I just want to talk about what is coming next. Since the death of King Abdullah in January 2015, the country has faced a lot of new challenges. There has been a war in Yemen. The Saudis have led the war in Yemen, which has cost only in 2015 $5.3 billion. As we all know, the oil price have dropped to below $30. There has been a peace agreement with Iran, if we can call it a peace agreement, which has strengthened a strategic rival, but has also added a new competitor on the energy market. And all this had led to the fact that the international reserves dropped for over $100 billion, from around 700 to slightly above $600 billion. Now the Saudi government has reacted with cuts in subsidies, which of course has mainly hit and is hitting, and this is what we're seeing now going on, hitting the system of alimentation. And research in Saudi Arabia shows that unrest usually is not sparked by lack of political rights, but it's rather sparked by economic dissatisfaction. So what we will see is an increase in social demands, which with a strong potential towards radicalization. So what needs to be done to keep the mainstream from radicalizing? As we said, we have a very large, open-minded, in the sense open to new ideas, open to radicalism, a mainstream of young people. So what does the Saudi government need to do? And I want to summarize this in 3 points. Of course, we need a strong reform in the education system. We need new curricula, we need more scholarships, we need education that focuses on creative thinking and innovation. We also need a whole new labor market. They're trying now to develop new sectors, 8 new sectors, so more young people can go into the private sector. According to a study by McKinsey, this is going to cost $4 trillion. They don't say where the money is coming from. But it also means, of course, a necessity for social and political opening. The alimentation needs to be replaced with something else, and it needs to be replaced with a more liberal system which creates a sustainable environment for social change and economic growth. Now, the Facebook co-founder, Chris Huge, he asked in the Jeddah Economic Forum 2014, he asked the question, what if Mark Zuckerberg had been born in Saudi Arabia? And there was a long silence in the room. But the answer is probably nothing would have happened, because the social environment was not permitting for Mark Zuckerberg, would have not been permitting for Mark Zuckerberg to develop Facebook or any other company in Saudi Arabia to develop their creative skills. So the government, first of all, needs to create an environment where young people can develop their skills and capacities. But this means, of course, not only an end to the social contract, but also the end of balance of power, the way Saudi Arabia has experienced it for the last 200 years. And this puts the country in front of tremendous challenges, because they need to change their strategy of stability through status quo towards stability through transformation if they want to survive. Also, just a side remark to look at the tremendous challenges. Thousands of young people are in jails in Saudi Arabia, and others are in fighting in Syria. One day they will come back. One day these young people have to be released from prison. What will happen then? How can they be reintegrated into the society? This being said, the step is really to create full-fledged citizens, to empower young Saudis to create their own future. So there's also, and I'm closing with this, there's also signs of hope. And there is an emerging civil society. As I mentioned earlier, 150,000 students have been abroad. Many of them are returning now. One of these students coming back is Khalid Al-Khudair. He's quite a famous figure today in Saudi Arabia. He came back from Canada and founded an organization, Glow Work, which helps young women to enter the labor market. So he has basically helped 27,000 women to enter the labor market. Also, another sign of hope is we have a whole generation of motivated and educated females who enter the labor market. And women employment, as low as it has been, has skyrocketed since 2010. And this not only becomes an economic necessity to integrate young women into the labor market, but it will also, of course, create a lot of social change and opening. And the last point here is women were allowed for the first time to participate actively and passively in the municipal elections in 2015. Also, 30 of the 150 Shura Council members nominated by the King are women. There has been a new NGO law which opens the door for a legal framework for civil activity, which has not been there so far. So I would argue that this development could actually lead to a real Arab Spring. An Arab Spring not in the sense of demonstrations in the street, but an Arab Spring development in the homes, in the universities, and in the workplace. Now, the Saudi government knows that only a gradual political and social opening can guarantee their continued stability, and also can keep young people from joining radical groups. So it's, in a sense, for the Saudi government, it's a fight against time, it's a fight against despaired young people who look for future alternatives. So people need to move from being subjects to citizens. Thank you very much.